Hello, and welcome to the 2022 Virtual Spring Lecture Series, hosted by Grey Roots Museum and Archives. I'm your host, Karen Noble. We acknowledge with respect the history, spirituality, and culture of the Anishinaabe, Six Nations of the Grand River, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat, Wyandot peoples, on whose traditional territories we gather and whose ancestors signed treaties with our ancestors. We recognize also the Métis and Inuit, whose ancestors shared this land and these waters. May we all, as treaty people, live with respect on this land and live in peace and friendship with all its diverse peoples. Thank you. Today is the first talk of the Spring 2022 series. Next week, on Wednesday, April 13th at 1 p.m., join Lori Orszewski for Breaking the Silence, Canada's British Home Children. On Tuesday, April 19th at 1 p.m., Richard Thomas returns for Owen Sound, Becoming a City, 1920 through the Great Depression, a sequel to today's talk. On Wednesday, April 26th at 1 p.m., join Peter Whitehead for Walt Disney's Ontario Connections. This final talk of the series is a live-only event taking place on Zoom. Email media@greyroots.com to register. Before we begin, there will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. You're welcome to submit a question in the YouTube comments. Please note you must be logged into a YouTube account to do so. If you're watching on greyroots.com, access the YouTube page by clicking Watch on YouTube.com in the bottom right of the video player. You can also submit a question to Grey Roots through Facebook Messenger or over email to media@greyroots.com. Thank you to Zach Erb, Media and Communications Coordinator at Grey Roots, for providing technical support for the series. And now for the presentation of the day, Owen Sound, Entering the 20th Century Through World War I. This talk will remain posted to view, so if you lose your connection, have to stop watching, want to watch any part again, or tell a friend, you can still do so. Link available for greyroots.com or visit the Grey Roots Museum and Archives YouTube channel. Today's presenter, Richard Thomas, is a broadcast journalist who has lived in Owen Sound since 1986. His first book, Gashead Willie, was published in 1996 and shortlisted by the Crime Writers of Canada as one of the best first novels of the year. Since then, Thomas has written more than a dozen fiction and nonfiction books about Owen Sound and area. He has been recognized by the City of Owen Sound, the Grey County Historical Society, and the Ontario Historical Society for his heritage work. Richard Thomas is a longtime member of the Owen Sound and North Grey Union Public Library Board and sits on Owen Sound City Council, presently in his second term. And now, welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Karen. It's great to be here, and thanks for that great introduction. I'll just get myself switched over here so that I'm sharing my screen, and assuming that it works. Oh, hang on. There. Hopefully you can all see my screen now. Owen Sound Entering the 20th Century Through World War I is an interesting subject. And before I get into it, though, there are a couple of things that I want to do to set the context. There were several major things that happened just prior to this talk. So by the end of the 1800s, Owen Sound was the busiest port in Canada. There we are. Being the eastern terminus of the CPR had been really beneficial to the community. During the 30 years following the CPR's arrival in the late 1880s, the population grew by 184% to 12,558 people. That growth outstripped the entire province of Ontario, making Owen Sound a bona fide boomtown during those years. Unfortunately, as with most booms, there was a bust not too far down the road. So the rumors had always swirled around Owen Sound. We all know about rumors if we do anything in social media. The rumors had swirled that the CPR planned to leave the community. Owen Sound more or less ignored those rumors. The local newspapers dismissed the possibility as a grain route only, and the grain trade was already declining in importance here, so there was little concern about it. The package freight business was where Owen Sound was making its name, along, of course, with passenger traffic. On May 19th, 1905, the CPR ended the speculation by announcing that Victoria Harbour near Midland had been selected as the second Georgian Bay terminus. An 88 branch line to the Peterborough area would shorten the distance to Montreal by 91 miles compared with Owen Sound. It'll also shorten the Toronto route by 20 miles. And the important thing, though, the grades out of Victoria Harbour were significantly lighter, which meant that locomotives could pull twice as much as they could from Owen Sound. And the way it worked in Owen Sound is a train engine could only actually pull about 5 cars at a time. So they would take a train out 5 cars at a time and leave the cars in Rockford, come back and get 5 more cars, and they would build the train at Rockford before finally hitching on to the whole thing and dragging it down to Toronto or Montreal or wherever it was going. So it was not a very efficient process. So the final chapter in this part of the story came on December 11th of 1911, when lighthouse keeper John McLean noticed smoke coming from CPR grain elevator A. At exactly the same time, coincidence? I'm not sure. Night watchman in elevator B raised the same alarm, but before either man could do much, the fire began to spread at a rapid pace. Both of the wooden CPR elevators filled with grain were completely destroyed, and if there'd been any hope of the CPR changing its mind about moving, that hope was extinguished with the fire. And with the destruction of the Owen Sound elevators, there was really nothing left to keep the CPR in Owen Sound. And in fact, in May of 1912, the last ship sailed out of Owen Sound. And so that was the first big thing that was to have a bearing on the future of the city. The other major change that was going to shape Owen Sound's future was the vote in 1906 to prohibit liquor sales in the community. For more than 30 years, the Women's Christian Temperance Union and its predecessor organizations had worked to have alcohol banned here because of the damage it was doing to local families and the community at large. Just before the turn of the century, Owen Sound was known nationally as a port town of between 3,000 and 4,000 people, noted from Halifax to Vancouver for drunkenness and gambling. How's that for a tagline for the community? We were given the nickname of Corkscrew Town, and the generally accepted story about how we got that name is this. A man was traveling across the country by train and had a refreshment with him, yet he had no implement with which to open it. Asking around, one of the other passengers said, "Just go up and down the train until you find somebody from Owen Sound. They'll have a corkscrew for sure." He did as he was advised, and on locating an Owen Sounder, who did indeed have a corkscrew, the legend was born. When the provincial government changed the Liquor License Act in 1905 to allow for the local option, Owen Sound wasted no time putting the question before its citizens, who voted 1,238 to 762 in favor of banning the sale of alcohol, starting a dry spell that was to last 66 years. But that's another story. So one of the first issues on the agenda of the town council following the election of January 1912 was dealing with the loss of the CPR. People had spoken of little else in the town. One of the suggestions that came up was so radical that it would change the very future of Owen Sound. It came from First Deputy Reeve John McQuaker, who introduced a motion to have a committee appointed to look into the question of Owen Sound becoming a city. The Daily Sun reported, "The CPR boats have left, and though their departure has not vitally injured the growth of the town, it has been heralded throughout the province that Owen Sound has become non-existent in the absence of the CPR fleet. As this is not the case, a move should be made to show the people of the province that Owen Sound is growing and that it is on the verge of becoming a city." So that motion was heartily endorsed by many of the councillors and unanimously approved. It would be nearly a decade before the dream became a reality, but a first step had been taken towards restoring community pride. With a population of nearly 13,000, Owen Sound was still experiencing growth despite the departure of the CPR. 105 new homes were under construction. There was talk of building a new school on the west side of the town. Dufferin School, shown here on 3rd Avenue West, was packed to the rafters with 718 students. The Board of Education was also seriously considering the construction of a new school in the Brook area to accommodate the growing number of children in the school system. In early April 1912, the weather turned mild and it began to rain. The subsequent rapid snowmelt turned rivers and streams into raging torrents, which emptied into the Potawatomi and Sydenham rivers. Both of them rose more than 10 feet over 2 days. On the Sydenham River, the Harrison Mill Dam breached at 3 a.m. on April 7th, sending a wall of water 8 feet high towards the inner harbor. A police constable was the first to notice. He telephoned the owners of boats that were in danger. The surging torrent of water and ice carried timbers, stumps, motorboats, and docks from the upper river, damaging or destroying everything in its path. The 9th Street footbridge collapsed, and most of the other damage was to smaller boats, including the steamer Veneta, which was swamped. On the Potawatomi River, 3 embankments were washed away, and the annex at Wright's Mill was undermined and collapsed. So, some good news was in order. Mayor Elias Lemon felt that the presence of swans would add extra beauty to the Sydenham River in the downtown area, and he wrote to the Thames Conservatory in London, England, to ask for some. He was informed that as the swans on the Thames were His Majesty's personal property, he should contact the Lord Chamberlain's office to make his request. Andrew Armitage, the Georgian Bay explorer, wrote, "Lo and behold, several crates showed up at the docks on May 17, 1912. Postmarked Buckingham Palace, they were addressed to the residence of Mayor Lemon. When they were opened, Owen Sound was delighted to find 3 pairs of the regal birds. There were 4 pure white swans and 2 dark ones. Soon they took up residence on Mayor Lemon's lawn. After they'd made a bit of a mess of the mayor's front lawn, the swans were moved to Queen's Park on the Sydenham River, where an enclosure allowed town citizens and tourists alike to view the celebrated birds. Now, those swans were eventually moved to Harrison Park, where their descendants remain today." As if the earlier collapse of the mill dam wasn't enough for the city, another trial by fire was in store when Kearney's Mill burned to the ground as it was being prepared for a new season. The fire was spotted on May 18th at about 2 o'clock in the morning by the night watchman, who ran to the boarding house at the north end of the lumber yard and roused the yard foreman, who called the fire department. The building was engulfed in flames and little could be done to save it. There was no loss of life, though a couple of firemen had a narrow escape when a 110-foot smokestack fell, narrowly missing them. The stock of lumber in the yard and the wharf were undamaged, but the building itself was a total loss estimated at $150,000. Less than a week later, the Sun announced the mill would be rebuilt, though nothing official had been confirmed by the owners. The assertions to the rest of the province that Owen Sound was still growing seemed to have some substance. The town once again passed special bylaws to loan money to new companies, a steel wire and nail factory, and the Superior Match Company of Toronto. Each firm was loaned $20,000 with a 20-year payback term. Towards the end of the summer, there was another big announcement. The town had secured the Malleable Iron Works, which would employ 150 men. The cost to taxpayers? Why, a mere $60,000. The bylaw loaning the money was put to a vote and approved by a large majority. The Sun reported, "It shows that the spirit for growth of Owen Sound is now deeper set in the minds of the people. The Malleable Iron Works, the construction of which will be started at once, will be one of the largest industries of the town. In the agreement, it stipulated that the plant will be composed of 2 large buildings, 80 by 250 feet, and will cost more than $100,000. Hugo Guntenkunst of Milwaukee arrived in Owen Sound to look at potential sites for the new Canadian Malleable Iron Company. In the end, the site of Kearney's Mill, which was never rebuilt, was the preferred location. Frank Kearney traveled to Owen Sound, and the property was sold within a day for the princely sum of $10,000. Outside of the bootleggers and prostitutes that Owen Sound was well known for, we were not a town given to salacious behaviors or titillating news. But in June 1913, the town was abuzz when it was revealed that the operatives of a white slaver were operating within the community. The procuress had been around town for a week or more, approaching teenage girls and offering them work in other Ontario cities. Police caught wind of the scheme when a young girl became suspicious of the woman and reported it. An investigation revealed the woman was attempting to secure victims for the immoral traffic. A formal investigation failed to result in charges. The story continued, however, with provincial police and Michigan State Police searching for a train conductor who was believed to be a part of the ring operating out of Detroit. Reports indicated that he had participated by securing 2 young girls at Guelph and sending them into the United States for immoral purposes. The girls originally from Owen Sound and there made the acquaintance of the conductor. Later, they moved to Guelph, where they were employed until about a month ago. While there was no comment on the matter from the train company, it did admit that the man had been missing for about 3 weeks, having taken a leave of absence from his job. November of 1913 brought one of the most devastating storms in Great Lakes history. Referred to as the White Hurricane, it raged for 4 full days from November 7th to 10th. The storm was the worst ever recorded on the lakes. Winds of 90 miles per hour whipped waves to a height of 35 feet in some places. Vessels made for shelter wherever it could be found. Owen Sound took the brunt of the storm on November 10th, when a fierce blizzard raged over the city. Docks and boathouses around the bay were torn apart and dashed against the shore. Windows were broken and trees were down, but everyone in Owen Sound survived the storm, which is not to say that all Owen Sounders survived it. In his book, Weather Bomb 1913, author Bruce Kemp wrote, "The gale shut down the Great Lakes Basin. The snow it generated was horrendous and paralyzed the region. Without communications, instant or otherwise, people did not know the true extent of the gale for days after its most damaging winds finished blowing. From Toronto to Cleveland, Sault Ste. Marie to Chicago, and as far west as Fort William and Duluth, all activity in the heart of North America skidded to a halt. In the end, 19 ships were destroyed and 19 others were grounded during the big blow. In all, nearly 300 people died, including half a dozen sailors from Owen Sound. A huge crowd dressed in black lined the streets a week later for a memorial. The Salvation Army Band led the procession to Town Hall, playing Handel's Dead March. 1914 began with good news, the long-anticipated opening of the new Carnegie Library. Constructed with a grant provided by Scottish philanthropist Andrew Carnegie, the library didn't cost the town a cent. Carnegie funded more than 2,500 libraries around the world, 125 of them in Canada. His conditions were that the town would demonstrate the need for a library, provide the building site, pay staff and maintain the library using public funds, and that it would always remain free for people to use. Owen Sound was able to meet the conditions, and the library, which had for years been located in a room donated by the town, finally had its own home. Built at a cost of $26,000, the Carnegie Library was one of the showpieces of the town. A major blow to the business community came with the death of Christopher Eaton, one of the founders of the Eaton Brothers Brewery. The Eaton Brothers ran a large brewing and malting operation on 3rd Avenue West, producing ale, porter, and stout. By 1887, the brewery had been shipping more than 6,000 barrels of beer annually across the province. The following year, they installed an automated malting system, allowing them to process 240,000 bushels of malt annually. Following the 1906 prohibition of alcohol in Owen Sound, Eaton Brothers stopped making beer altogether and concentrated on the production of malt, which was shipped across the country. It was on a business trip by train to Quebec and eastern provinces that Christopher Eaton developed a severe cold, which had become pneumonia by the time he arrived home. Less than a week later, at the age of 60, he succumbed to his illness. Survived by his wife, Annie Jaffray Eaton, and his son, Jaffray Eaton, the Times News report described Eaton as a kindly gentleman, publicly spirited, and a man who was always keenly active in promoting the industrial and transportation interests of the town, and the place he occupied in Owen Sound's business life will be difficult to fill. The town hall flag flew at half-mast until Christopher Eaton was buried in Greenwood Cemetery. Another death, a half a world away, would have an impact on Owen Sound and all of its residents. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, and his wife were assassinated while traveling in Sarajevo. Few could have guessed the assassination was the flashpoint that would begin what would eventually be referred to as the war to end all wars. Shortly after the assassinations, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to the Kingdom of Serbia, which was partially rejected. Armies were mobilized, and following an engagement between Austrian, Hungarian, and Serbian troops, war was declared. Great Britain entered the First World War on August 4th, 1914, when Germany refused to respect Belgium's neutrality. The British declaration of war automatically included the Dominion of Canada as a member of the British Empire. The first major confrontation between the world powers took place on August 23rd in Belgium. On August 5th, 1914, the Sun published a war extra edition of the paper. Its editor wrote, "In Owen Sound, and what is true of Owen Sound is true of every place where the British flag flies, a continuous crowd of anxious people have been present in front of the newspaper offices from early morning until late at night, ever since the hostilities were declared in Europe. Every fresh dispatch has been eagerly read, and what is the news of the war is the question that is asked on every hand whenever two or more people meet." In the same edition, it was reported that 20 Hungarians employed at the malleable ironworks had left their jobs, having received the call from home to report for duty. The chair factory closed its doors as it felt it couldn't fulfill international orders with a war on, and the prices of commodities such as flour and sugar began to rise in anticipation of wartime shortages. Canada and other Commonwealth countries were warned to prepare for war, and on August 7th, recruiting began at the Owen Sound Armory. The world was going to war, and the men and the boys of Owen Sound were eager to take part in what some saw as a great adventure. The town council got into the spirit of things during a marathon meeting. Discussing everything from the weather to the war, council passed a resolution assuring His Majesty and the rulers of Great Britain of their patriotic and loyal sympathy and support morally and every other way. Captain Jaffray Eaton, son of Christopher Eaton, asked the council to make provisions for the wives and families of those volunteering to go to war. The meeting ended with a rousing rendition of God Save the King. Before the end of the month, the 83 men of the Grey Regiment would be leaving for training in Belcartier, Quebec. War wasn't the only thing on the minds of Owen Sounders in 1915. The Sun reported that on June 3rd, two plainclothes policemen had spotted notorious Canadian bank robber Norman Red Ryan and an accomplice in Queen's Park, near the new Carnegie Library. He was wanted for 2 bank jobs in Toronto. In his book, The Big Red Fox, author Peter McSherry wrote, "Ryan jerked out a revolver and began shooting. This touched off an all-day running gun battle through the bush of Sydenham Township, with Ryan several times firing on pursuing police posse. Finally, the desperate pair were run down far out in Georgian Bay, trying to escape in a leaky old rowboat using bed slats as paddles. Ryan and his associate, a man named Turner, were captured and locked up to await trial. They almost didn't make it if not for the sharp-eyed jail governor." The Herald reported, "Their plan to escape was nipped in the bud Tuesday by Governor Miller, who discovered they'd sawed the bars of the doors and a window in a corner almost through with a hacksaw. Very little sawing would have been left for them to get out, the bars being sawed to within a fraction of an inch. The cuts were cleverly concealed by being filled with soap and then blackened." On June 16th, Ryan was convicted of 2 counts of burglary and 1 count of shooting with the intent to maim, and he was sentenced to 8 years in the Kingston pen. He was dragged from the court kicking and screaming and swearing to return and have revenge on all who had anything to do with his arrest. The threat was never carried out, but Owen Sound hadn't yet heard the last of Red Ryan. When it entered the war, Great Britain had no standing army, just the small professional British Expeditionary Force of 100,000 men. The German army, conversely, had 1.1 million men. Despite being outnumbered 3-1 in Belgium, the small British force caused huge damage to the Germans, slowing their advance. It was a lucky strike, but the superior numbers of the German army were destined to overwhelm all who stood in its way. The call went out, and across the Dominion of Canada, boys and men answered. Local militia units, including the 31st Grey Regiment, were among the first Canadians to the front, leaving Canada by ship in 1915. Regiment member R.P. Kennedy wrote to his classmates at the Owen Sound Collegiate about his trip across the North Atlantic aboard the HMS Lapland. He wrote, "As the boat was coming from New York, she is loaded down with munitions in every little nook that they can put them in. All the halls are filled with boxes filled with cordite and patrol. So if a submarine hits us, look out." There were more than 2,500 officers and men on board the Lapland, and the trip was uneventful until October 28, when the soldiers on the vessel stood round-the-clock watch for German submarines. Kennedy's letter continued, Every man stood by his boat all day, double guard and lookouts all over. We were allowed to sleep, so I don't know what happened during the day, but I know there were a good many scared boys on board. About 6:00 p.m., 2 destroyers came alongside, one on the left, the other on the right, and the relief was felt all over the boat as they escorted us into the harbor. Kennedy and his mates arrived at the harbor in Plymouth, England. The next day, they headed for Shorncliffe Camp, a training facility in Kent that had been built in 1794. The weary troops arrived at 3:00 in the morning and were assigned to one of the 5 barracks at the camp. The war had started for Grey County, and before it was over, many of its boys and men would make the same trip undertaken by the 31st Regiment. In his book, Soldiers of the Soil, Grey County Goes to War, 1914 to 1918, George Hour wrote, "When the war began, many optimists thought it would end by Christmas. No one anticipated the speed of the German assault, which overran Belgium and forced the British Expeditionary Force to retreat. The German advance ended in the Battle of the Marne as French and British armies took the offensive and forced a German retreat. Retreating Germans stopped, however, on well-located defensive ground to stand and fight. The use of machine guns and the accuracy of indirect fire, such as artillery, forced back the advancing Allied armies." The recruiting continued in Owen Sound, Meaford, Durham, and many of the small villages across Grey County. In 1915, the 147th Battalion was raised under the command of Colonel G.F. McFarland. Jaffray Eaton was the son of Annie Jaffray Eaton and the late Christopher Eaton. A graduate of the Owen Sound Collegiate Institute and University of Toronto, Jaffray worked for a time as a news reporter for the Toronto Globe, which was published by his grandfather, Senator Robert Jaffray. A longtime military man, Eaton was appointed adjutant of the 86th Machine Gun Battalion, but he wanted to go overseas, so he had his rank reverted to major, and in 1916 he transferred to the 147th Grey County Battalion as its second in command. Pardon me. In mid-May 1916, Eaton took 78 men with him to prepare Camp Niagara for the arrival of the battalion. It was soon discovered the infrastructure of the camp was unable to support such a large contingent of men. They were moved instead to Camp Borden, which was still under construction. The battalion trained at Borden from June until September, when word was received that it was heading overseas. The men were given a week's leave to return home and say their goodbyes. The Sun reported, amid the cheers and goodbyes of one of the largest crowds for any occasion, the special train bearing the members of the 147th Battalion back to Camp Borden at the conclusion of their last leave pulled out from the CPR station at 3:45 yesterday afternoon. Boarding the train with baskets of peaches and grapes given to them by the town council, the men of the 147th were blissfully unaware that they were in for an unexpected delay before leaving Canada. Arriving in Amherst, Nova Scotia, to await orders to continue on to Halifax, the battalion was quarantined for a full month due to an outbreak of diphtheria. Finally, on November 13, 1916, the 147th sailed with 32 officers and 910 other ranks aboard the Olympic, sister ship of the infamous Titanic. On arrival in England, the battalion was broken up and the soldiers were absorbed into the ranks of the British troops. The first overseas casualty for the men of Grey County didn't actually occur on the battlefield. It occurred at Shoreham Camp when a car hit Private George Day of Sydenham Township. The father of 2 suffered a broken leg and a badly injured arm, and he later died of blood poisoning. On February 22, 1917, the battalion was moved to Shorncliffe Camp. Ed MacDonald wrote to his friend Minnie Wright following the move. "You will have noticed that we have changed our camp. We moved up here yesterday, and so far, we are favorably impressed with the camp. Not quite so much mud as was at Shoreham, and not as many rats, apparently. Rather than being sent to the front as a complete battalion, men were culled from the 8th Reserve and sent wherever soldiers were needed. By April 1917, more than half the battalion had been to the front. Before much more time would pass, all of the men from Grey County would know exactly what kind of hell they had gotten themselves into." In every edition of the Sun newspaper, the editor encouraged Owen Sound and Grey County to get involved in the war effort. Across the county, women like Minnie Wright answered the call. Wright was tireless in her efforts to support the boys who had gone overseas. In addition to writing letters, Minnie and hundreds like her across the county knit socks and assembled care packages for the boys overseas. And the boys, Ed McDonald included, appreciated their efforts. Your box came, Minnie, as a most pleasant surprise. You have no idea how much I appreciated the same. It was very kind and thoughtful indeed of you to send it. All I can do under the present circumstances is to thank you very much. Probably, Minnie, if I were to meet you at the Boyd Street rink, I would have a skate with you. Both Wright and McDonald were members of the Sydenham Skating Club, which skated at the Boyd Street Arena, located in what was formerly known as Ryerson Park, during the winter. It wasn't unusual for a local orchestra to be on hand to play for the skaters, though more often than not, someone would bring a Victrola and the latest 78 RPM records. The Boyd Street Arena was later taken down and transported to Victoria Park for use by the Agricultural Society as a barn. In one downtown Owen Sound home, 10 local girls worked in a front room workshop assembling chains for Bethlehem fixed ammunition boxes, which were shipped to England full and returned to Canada empty. The chains manufactured in Owen Sound prevented the lids from being separated from the boxes. Owen Sound resident Annie Eaton, who we've referred to a number of times here, had a completely different idea for supporting the local boys. When her only son Jaffrey shipped overseas, she went along. Together with the wife of Dr. Richard Howie of Owen Sound, they started the Grey Rooms. In her first letter to the Owen Sound Sun, Mrs. Eaton wrote, "The large room we hope to furnish as a sitting room where our soldier boys from Grey County may come whenever they wish and find a Canadian welcome, the Canadian newspapers, a desk where they may write their letters, and between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, a cup of tea and Canadian cakes." When visiting the Canadian Red Cross rooms a few days ago, I was arranging with Mrs. Wadd to cooperate with me in giving us information about our wounded or ill soldiers. Her daughter is in charge of distributing newspapers to the hospitals, and she would be grateful for a dozen copies of the Sun and the Times each week. The boys enjoy the home papers, especially when they're in the hospital. Throughout the war, the ladies of the Grey Rooms would visit the wounded and injured, bringing cigarettes, food, and a friendly smile whenever possible. They recorded information about each soldier in a ledger, and this is a page from that ledger. In addition to the comfort this provided the soldiers, the ladies also made sure that the families knew the condition and location of their husbands, brothers, and sons. October 26, 1917 was the date chosen for the start of the Canadian offensive at Passchendaele. Many men from Grey County were in the lines, including Ed McDonald, Jaffrey Eaton, and Captain Tom Rutherford of Leith. Tom Rutherford had become friends with Jaffrey Eaton years before, when Eaton was a captain with the 31st Grey Regiment. Eaton had been allowed to revert his rank so he could join the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles in France. It was there that the two friends were reunited, as Rutherford recalled in an article written by his nephew, Jason Adair. About 200 yards from our trench was a pillbox on somewhat higher ground than where I was standing. On this flank, I met my longtime friend who just joined the battalion, Jaffrey Eaton, who had been second in command of our Grey County Battalion and had reverted to lieutenant to get to France. They were stationed side by side and would work in tandem to achieve an objective once the battle started at 5:40 a.m. on October 26th. Rutherford described the last time he saw his friend alive. It was almost time to move out into our forward positions, so having confirmed what we decided the day before, we shook hands and each with our little sections of 4 men went his separate way. We were no sooner there than a flash of light in the semi-darkness behind told us that our shells were coming, so we laid low in shell holes lest any fall short. Rutherford advanced with the rest of the Canadian contingent and only learned later that his friend Jaffrey Eaton had perished in the opening moments of the battle. 60 men from Grey County were killed at Passchendaele. Ed McDonald wrote to Minnie Wright following the battle. Was out on rest for a few days, and they were well-earned rest days too, because we had just finished a very strenuous trip to the line. The trip which no doubt is responsible for Grey County and Owen Sound having so many sorrow-stricken homes tonight. It was the trip that brought an end to Jack Campbell, Jaffray Eaton, George Ewan's, and Charlie Findley's military careers. I certainly do feel for the home folks in Canada. 15 months after the battle at Passchendaele, Tom Rutherford returned to the battlefield alone. In his memoir, he surmised that his friend had been killed in the early moments of the battle, likely by Canadian shells falling short of the enemy lines. The first rounds came in almost a straight line right in front of us. But the second rounds were not so good, and many fell short as the guns had very little platform in the mud a mile behind. I think probably it was one of these that got Jaffray Eaton, as I found his bones when I visited Passchendaele 16 months later before we left Belgium to come home to Canada. Someone had apparently covered him up with earth where he fell and put a little picket cross about a foot high, but the rains had washed his skull clean, and while I could find no identity disc, I knew it was Jaffray by his teeth, which were quite distinctive. I believe there were many more killed the same way that morning. So one more Owen Sounder who deserves to be mentioned in relation to the battle at Passchendaele is, of course, Tommy Holmes. Tommy was part of a second wave of the attack, which rolled past the first wave once it had captured its positions. The objective of the second wave was the crest of the ridge. Lieutenant J. Milton Doby, who had worked for The Sun as a reporter before the war, submitted this account. Plowing through the mud and water, plunging from shell hole to shell hole, advancing over ground swept by relentless fire from rifle and machine gun, they went forward, but that death-dealing hail of bullets was taking an awful toll. Finally, in order to save themselves from what seemingly was going to be complete annihilation, they were forced to take cover in convenient shell holes. Unceasingly, the enemy gunfire raked the ground where they were and over which they had to pass in order to reach the position that had been assigned to them to take. Tommy Holmes saw that most of the fire pinning them down was coming from two machine gun nests that had been set up near a pillbox. Armed with only a grenade, he charged up the hill, dodging from shell hole to shell hole. Making his way closer to the machine guns, Tommy realized that every once in a while, the firing stopped as the crews reloaded. Doby's account continued. Suddenly there came a moment when both guns ceased firing simultaneously. Holmes knew what it meant. Both guns were reloading. It was his opportunity, and quick as a flash, before the guns began working again, he ran forward to within 15 yards and was able to take shelter in a shell hole before the guns opened up again. But he was within bombing distance now, and pulling the pin of the grenade he carried, he hurled it with unerring accuracy into the midst of the machine gunners. Holmes ran all the way back to where his mates were hidden, grabbed another grenade, and ran to the pillbox. He threw the bomb in the rear entrance, and a moment later, 19 men came out with their hands up. They surrendered to Holmes, who was standing there alone and unarmed. Tommy Holmes was awarded the Victoria Cross, the youngest Canadian to receive that honor. The other Owen Sounder to receive the Victoria Cross was, of course, Billy Bishop, dubbed by the Toronto Star to be Canada's best aviator. Bishop initially enlisted with the Mississauga Horse Cavalry Regiment, but soon transferred to the 7th Canadian Mounted Rifles. In 1915, he transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, where he initially trained as an observer as there were no places available for pilots. Bishop received his wings in November 1916, and in March 1917, he arrived in France, where he flew the Nieuport 17 fighter. He turned out to be a natural and was soon racking up win after win against enemy aircraft. Following one flight, a mechanic counted 210 bullet holes in his aircraft. Not only was Bishop a skilled flyer, he was lucky as well. In June 1917, Bishop flew a solo mission across enemy lines to an enemy aerodrome. In his memoir, Winged Warfare, Bishop wrote, "I pointed my nose towards the ground and opened fire with my gun, scattering the bullets all around the machines and coming down to 50 feet in doing so. I don't know how many men I hit or what damage was done, except that one man at least fell and several others ran to pick him up. Then, clearing off to one side, I watched the fun. I'd forgotten by this time that they would, of course, have machine guns on the aerodrome, And as I was laughing to myself, they tore around in every direction on the ground like people going mad or rabbits scurrying about. I heard the old familiar rattle of the quick firers on me. I didn't dare go too far away, however, as then I would not be able to catch the machines as they left the ground. So turning quickly and twisting about, I did my best to evade the fire from the ground. Before it was over, Bishop shot down 3 planes that were taking off to attack him and destroyed several others. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for his dawn raid, and in 1917, he returned to Canada on leave. At the Grey Rooms, word of her beloved son's death struck Annie Eaton hard. She immediately withdrew from service in the rooms and went into seclusion, having been ordered to do so by her personal physician. In his letter to Minnie Wright, Ed MacDonald commented on the deaths of his comrades. We do not notice it much over here, or if we do, we look on such things in a much different light. A fellow gets hardened to such things. He has simply got to. As for myself and the scrap, I never will know how I came through it without a scratch. Talk about an experience. But I know I will never be able to erase the scene and the scenes from my memory. In late September and early October 1917, there were a number of decisive battles, including the Battle of Cambrai, where Captain Robert Pollock of Owen Sound fell. His wife received a letter from Mrs. Eaton. You may always be proud that your husband was one of the gallant Canadians who won the most important point at the turn of the tide. His work and example are not in vain, and the great peace now seems to be within our grasp. May the peace that is beyond understanding be yours. Mrs. Eaton may never have recovered from the death of her beloved son, but her sense of duty to the other boys of the Grey County brought her back to the Grey Rooms. She and Mrs. Howie and a small contingent of volunteers continued to visit the growing number of sick and wounded. When they returned to Owen Sound in 1999, it was to a hero's welcome. The city paraded the women through the streets, and at a civic dinner commemorating their efforts, each was presented with a gold pin. Throughout 1918, 19, and 20, men returned home from the war. The reason for the long delay was the dramatic lack of ships. More than 5,000 merchant marine vessels were destroyed by German U-boats, so there were few available to return the men home. The local papers kept close tabs on the returnees. Every edition for 2 years listed men who had returned or were expected to return. Many were unable to pick up their lives where they'd left off. Injury, shell shock, and a lack of jobs all contributed to the post-war climate in Owen Sound and Grey County. The Soldiers' Settlement Project helped establish 44 veterans on farmland, and grants assisted in the purchase of livestock and steed. Still, many were unable to find work. The last thing the war-weary residents of Grey County, and the world for that matter, needed was a post-war pandemic. But that's exactly what they got when the Spanish flu arrived. Many believe the flu, an original variant of the H1N1 strain, began in the Midwestern United States and was carried overseas to the trenches by military personnel. Others suggest it may have started in China, but it doesn't really matter where it came from. The simple fact was, it was deadly. In Canada, the flu came back with returning soldiers who arrived at Quebec, which was particularly hard hit. By October 1918, there were 30 cases of the Spanish flu in Owen Sound, and before the end of that month, schools and movie theaters were closed and public meetings of any sort were discouraged. In Owen Sound, the factories had many off work due to the flu. Staff at the Kennedy's Foundry were permitted to come into work an hour later every morning so they could first tend to the sick at home. Some of the Grey County deaths from the Spanish flu were James Powell Barlow, a 33-year-old lawyer, and Peter Crookus, a 33-year-old fruit seller. These two deaths underlying the worst part of the pandemic. While many strains of influenza strike the elderly or the young, the Spanish flu was devastating to previously healthy young adults. In total, there were 100 flu deaths in Grey County. More than half of the victims were under the age of 29. By the time the pandemic ended in 1920, 500 million people worldwide had been infected, and between 50 and 100 million had died. When the 22 million military and civilian deaths caused by the war are added to that, It makes the second decade of the 20th century one of the deadliest in human history. In Owen Sound, tensions ran high following the war. Many men couldn't find work, and a group of the unemployed were angry to learn that foreign workers against whose nations they had recently fought had high-paying jobs in local factories. A small group got together and began to visit local employers, pressuring them to fire anyone with a foreign-sounding name so that a returned man could be hired instead. To say this caused some upset in town would be something of an understatement. Some of the sentiments of the returned men could be summed up in a letter from a former Owen Sounder living in Toronto. It read, "Here goes a few lines on behalf of all the old Grey Battalion boys and myself. When is the old burg going to come out of the oblivion and do something for the boys in appreciation for services rendered? I have been traveling all over Canada, and up to date, your town is the only place I've struck which has not given one and all the boys who enlisted there something for remembrance. Think it over, Owen Sound." Well, Owen Sound may have been willing to think it over, as the anonymous author suggested, but before it could, the anger of the returned men came to a head when the Reeve of Newstead, Joseph Weber, was found to be spending a night in Owen Sound following a meeting of the county council. Weber had been charged with a number of serious offenses under military law, including making seditious statements. To compound matters, his son had been sentenced the week previous to 10 years in jail for desertion. An angry mob stormed the hotel that Weber was staying at and dragged him out of bed just before midnight. Some thought he should swear his loyalty to king and country, while others thought he should be run out of town. The majority won, and Weber was escorted from the hotel out past the GTR station on the west side of the harbor. Drawn by the noise, a large crowd of citizens joined in, and soon there were fears that Weber might be seriously injured by the aggressive mob. Several returned men were forced to act as bodyguards to the beleaguered politician. Some injuries were sustained, but nothing life-threatening. Just north of 14th Street, Weber was handed his suitcase and given a shove by one of the gathered company. He walked from Owen Sound to Shallow Lake, where he caught the morning train back to Newstead. Beyond the plight of the returned men, the incorporation of Owen Sound as a city had taken a negative turn. Grey County Council had taken a stand against Owen Sound and was actively working to defeat the Bill of Incorporation at the provincial legislature. But we'll continue with that story next time. So that's the end of today's talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I will just end my screen sharing. I think I will. There we are. And we're back. So I'm not sure if there are any questions.
Thanks so much for that, Richard. There are some thumbs up, and there's one comment from YouTube where HM just comments that he or she also had a second time's great uncle, James F. Smith of Owen Sound and of the same regiment, also died the same day, October 26, 1917. So I think that comment came in when you were talking about Jaffray Eaton.
Okay.
A question about your writing process. So when you're looking to do another book, what comes first? Do you have an idea of what you want to do, or do you see material and take it from there?
Well, I usually have an idea, but sometimes the idea that I have becomes something completely different as I work through it. And I'll give you an example. I'm working on a book that I hope to have out this summer. It is tentatively titled Amazing Owen Sounders, and it's about an idea I had to write about all of the amazing people I've learned about that you may never have heard of, but who went out in the world and did incredible things and were well known for the things they did. Out of my research for that book, I discovered an Owen Sounder, a fellow called Lucky Scott, who was quite famous in his day, but very few people know of him today. So I'm also writing a second book. So I'm writing two books simultaneously. And the second book is about Lucky Scott because he was actually so incredible and lived such an adventurous life that he gets his own book. I couldn't fit it into just the context of a single book involving many people. So writing is a very organic process, and I learned long ago to trust my instincts and follow the ideas that interested me enough to pursue.
And just as an addendum to that, I thought maybe you'd like the opportunity to talk about Emma Scott Naismith, if anybody had any material out there. I think that ties in with Lucky Scott.
Sure. Yes. Emma Scott Naismith is going to be in my book, Amazing Owen Sounders. And she started a school in Toronto called the Margaret Eaton School. And she is acknowledged across Canada as the mother of little theater in Canada. She began the little theater movement in the early 1900s. And very few people locally have heard of her, so I thought that her short story should come to light. And certainly, if anyone within earshot has any information on the Scott family, they're the children of Reverend James Scott, who was the Methodist minister in Owen Sound. And aside from Lucky and Emma, Victoria Scott, their older sister, was actually Owen Sound's first librarian and was the librarian at the Carnegie Library when it opened. So, the more you research, the more threads you follow, and the more you learn about the place. I mean, I could go on and on and on. I don't think a 45-hour lecture would be long enough to talk about all the things I think are so neat about Owen Sound's history and Grey County.
Well, there's always another book.
Well, there's always another book. The question is there the time and the energy to do the book? But as I say, I am hoping to have Amazing Owen Sounders out, or Incredible Owen Sounders, or whatever it ends up being titled, should be out towards the end of the summer this year.
Great. So from Facebook, there is a question. Did Owen Sound ever do something for the returning men? What kind of recognition were they looking for? So I know
that's a good question. That was just one letter. What did end up happening in Owen Sound, and some people will certainly know this, is the first chapter of the Canadian Legion formed in Owen Sound. And of course, the next thing you'll ask is, why is it called Branch 6? And let me just say, politics. Because somewhere it was decided that there was no way Owen Sound would have Branch 1. And so Branch 1, I believe, is in Toronto, and Owen Sound was Branch 6. But very shortly after the events that I've been talking about here, the Legion was formed in Owen Sound, and that did go a long way towards settling a lot of the problems of the returned men, at least the employment problems. And it gave them somewhere to go and talk to other people who had been through similar experiences, which I think after something like the First War was very important.
Yeah, absolutely. So one more question from Facebook. The height of Owen Sound's population, we heard there were up to 60,000. I think it wasn't that high.
No,
I apologize. Yeah, how high Owen Sound population was. It was definitely booming. But,
yeah, it was booming. It was outstripping Ontario. So Owen Sound grew by about 184% in about a 20-year period, which was far faster than anywhere in Ontario. But even at that, when the CPR left, it was just over 12,000. And I think, the peak we're sort of seeing it, we stabled out around 21, 22,000, and that's where we remain at present.
There's another question from YouTube. Where can we purchase your books?
You can purchase my books at the Ginger Press bookstore in downtown Owen Sound, or online at gingerpress.com. And I believe the bookshop at Grey Roots still has some of my books as well.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So one question for me, and it's not quite about Owen Sound, but since we used your Antarctica picture promotion, I just wondered your process to get there and how long it took.
Oh, well,
Not longer, 100 years ago, but
actually, I went to Antarctica in 2016, in December of 2016, and that actually came up very suddenly. I hadn't planned. It was never on my bucket list. And at that time, I was writing for the company. I do a lot of freelance writing, and I was writing for the company that does the expeditions. And they offered my writing partner and I a passage on one of the ships at what they call their family and friends discount. So it was just one of those things that I hadn't planned for it, but it was too good to pass up. So I went and spent 11 days on the Ocean Diamond, cruising to the Antarctic Peninsula, and saw more penguins than I probably would ever need to see in a whole lifetime, and lots of other wildlife. And I actually slept out overnight on Antarctica, which was quite a highlight.
well, I think that is all the questions that have come through. Definitely appreciate you having prepared this talk and looking forward to the second part in 2 weeks' time. So next week is Lori Olszewski with the British Home Children talk, and then the following Tuesday is the second part of Richard's talk. So thanks again, and we'll look forward to part 2.
All right, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.